Hello people, I made this recording to introduce you to the gender maturity gap. We're told that girls mature early, and yet there's a widespread perception that girls have trouble completing what they started. Meaning there are lots of women who are fluent in the patter of daytime television but who actually behave as if they're on Jerry Springer. So how do we unravel this paradox? How do we explain why so many girls are described as mature and so many women prove they're not? Now, this is not just a question of dating advice, because the powers wielded by women in society have been compared to placing a loaded revolver in their hands. So the possibility that women might not be reaching their full maturity means we're placing that revolver in the hands of children. The fact is, though, that maturity is like beauty. Everything is relative, and its value is measured in the eye of the beholder. So in order to talk about maturity in quantifiable terms, we need to break it down. For that purpose, then, I intend to follow the trail of evidence left by a behaviour that is characteristic of immaturity, namely attention-seeking behaviour. This behaviour is the public health crisis of the digital age, a palatable and addictive additive to everything we consume, one that has no restrictions on its use, making a crisis and a scandal that surpasses anything the tobacco industry was able to accomplish. One reason that it manages to avoid public scrutiny is that attention-seeking behaviour is a central part of manipulative consumer strategies, meaning that researchers and journalists face the wrath of the media if they displease advertisers. Another reason is its association with children. After all, when combined in measured amounts, attention and admiration become encouragement, or attention and sympathy becomes comfort and security. These feelings are essential to the growth and development of every child, and in the normal course of events, the child would surrender something of itself to become the adult. But it would seem that in the case of a very large number of women, something is arresting that transformation. Some people will insist that both men and women exhibit attention-seeking behaviour equally, but that suggestion contradicts the patterns of mass consumer spending. In fact, it is the disparity in the patterns of consumer behaviour which explains why advertisers and the media conglomerate that depends on advertising money go to such great lengths to flatter, indulge and pander to women. Whether it's the hairdresser, the beauty salon, the perfume counter, the pedicure, the cosmetic store, the boutique, the accessory counter, the jeweller, the glamour magazine, the shoe shop, or whatever, it all amounts to a quantifiable amount of time and money that is devoted to the pursuit of attention. By whichever measure we use, therefore, women are spending a lot more money and, just as important, a lot more time trying to find the right look and capture the right attention. This disparity indicates the degree to which women exhibit a behaviour which is essential to the growth of the child, but toxic to the mental health of the adult and the mental health of the people she interacts with. Big tech platforms got in on this act by building social networks that appeal to attention seekers. They even fine-tuned their user interfaces to make the viewing metrics and the likes of content producers publicly visible. This is a feature which helps them to exploit the competitive psychology of attention seekers. Attention and admiration used to feed the stars of stage and screen, and many a politician too. But in recent times the pursuit of it has become a cottage industry, one that pollutes the atmosphere of public well-being. So when we now take stock of public mental health in a world that is racked with suicide, depression, self-harm, and a whole range of pathologies, damaging behaviours and damaged relationships, we can find significant evidence of attention-seeking behaviour being either directly or indirectly implicated in these problems. At this point, I have to issue a word of caution for anybody wishing to read through the literature about the psychological conditions mentioned here, because there are few things more malleable than the language of psychology when it comes to obscuring inconvenient truths about their biggest customers, namely women. In fact, we already know that we have a genre of writing called chick lit and a genre of cinema called chick flick, but few people are aware that we also have a genre of crypto-feminism called chick psychology. So one has to take the narratives with a healthy dose of skepticism. That said, a Wikipedia search for attention-seeking behaviour brings up the following description, some parts of which will no doubt strike a chord with this audience. It says, quote, attention-seeking behaviour is to act in a way that is likely to elicit attention. People are taught to engage in both positive and negative attention-seeking behaviour independent of the actual benefit or harm to health. Most behaviour that is motivated by attention-seeking is considered to be driven by self-consciousness and thus an externalisation of personality rather than internal and self-motivated behaviour. This type of influence on behaviour can result in a potential loss of a person's sense of agency." End quote. So when they say positive and negative behaviour independent of the actual benefit or harm, they're talking about that old dictum attributed to the founder of Barnum's Circus, which was, "There's no such thing as bad publicity," meaning that when admiration is not available, sympathy will do, because they're both forms of attention. One of the inconvenient truths about attention-seeking is that it is very competitive. So the collective pursuit of attention and admiration becomes a race to the top, just as the collective pursuit of attention and sympathy also becomes a race to the top. This race can also be described as the pursuit of hierarchy in a competition where women have the advantage of privilege. The statement about benefit or harm can also involve real physical self-harm, which is closely associated with attention-seeking impulses. On this subject, Wikipedia correctly records that, quote, "self-harm is more common in females than males, with this risk being 5 times greater in the 12 to 15 age group," end quote. Another benefit or harm concern is the prevalence of anxiety disorders in women. This happens because, at a primal level, the display of fear or anxiety attracts attention. So when we allow people to think that attention has value, we are unintentionally giving them incentives to be anxious. Based on this formula, we can predict an imbalance in the levels of anxiety between males and females that corresponds with an imbalance in their respective tendency towards attention-seeking behaviour. Consequently, we should expect anxiety disorders to be more common in women than men, and this disparity is again confirmed by Wikipedia, which states women are affected by phobias about twice as often as men. Other specific conditions that are rooted in attention-seeking behaviour include narcissism, Munchausen syndrome, and Munchausen syndrome by proxy, the latter being a condition that places children in mortal danger, in 90% of cases that danger coming from their biological mothers. Another condition closely linked with attention-seeking is borderline personality disorder, which affects as much as 6% of the population, millions of people, with women being diagnosed 3 times as often as men. The elephant in the room, though, when it comes to attention-seeking behaviour is hysteria. Conversion disorder is the most recent name given to what used to be called hysteria, and the name suggests the presumed cause, meaning that stress gets converted into physical or behavioural symptoms. The US National Institutes of Health states on its online page titled "Conversion Disorder, Mind versus Body" that, quote, "conversion disorder is a condition where mental or emotional crises produce stress that converts to a physical problem," end quote. In fact, virtually all of the literature about hysteria or conversion disorder consistently repeats that this condition is caused by stress. But this is an explanation that reflects very negatively on women, because if stress is the cause of hysteria, and the vast majority of hysterics are female, and work is such a common cause of stress, then employers should think more carefully about employing women. Dr. Robert Bartholomew, writing thus about hysteria for Psychology Today, states, quote, "It sounds sexist, but the literature does not lie. The pattern is invariably the same. Most and often all of those affected are females. This pattern holds true over 99% of the time." Having said that, he then attributes the cause of the dysfunction to stress. So the medical theory that girls and women might be prone to hysteria in conditions of stress, especially when they're gathered in groups or even when they're in communication by social media, could be seen as a risk factor for employers and for public health services. The risk might seem small, but that's only because the prevalence of outbreaks is underreported. An article in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine states, quote, "There's increasing recognition that mass psychogenic illness is underappreciated, underreported, and poses a significant health and social problem," end quote. The mass psychogenic illness referred to here is a kind of hysteria orgy. Another cause for concern is suggestibility. An article in Psychology Today states that hysteria makes people, quote, "highly suggestible," easily susceptible to the influence of others." End quote. This claim is also problematic because there's no evidence or logical reason why stress might cause a susceptibility to suggestion. And in the second place, because a susceptibility to suggestion leads to impaired judgment, which calls into question the suitability of people who are prone to hysteria for positions of authority and responsibility. On the other hand, attention seekers are very open to suggestions that flatter and indulge them, which makes them particularly susceptible to the narratives of advertisers and feminists. Therefore, the explanations given for hysteria or conversion disorder make it look like one of those medieval diseases where the cure is worse than the disease. It may well be that these explanations are designed for a well-intentioned purpose, such as mentioned in a JRSM article, that, quote, "those affected can return to health with their dignity and self-respect unaffected," end quote. But these good intentions also have the effect of obscuring real causes which one must suspect are manifesting elsewhere with varying degrees of complication. Furthermore, even though the good intentions of public health experts may seem admirable from a certain point of view, they stand in stark contrast to the alacrity with which those same experts shower young males with diagnostic explanations designed to shame them rather than preserve their dignity. Explanations against which young males in particular have no defence. There are therefore many very good reasons why we should rethink the cause and effect explanations of female hysteria. For that purpose, it's worth noting that virtually all of the literature about conversion disorder or histrionic personality disorder, same thing, describes attention-seeking behaviour as being characteristic of the condition. Psychology Today states that, quote, "histrionic personality disorder is characterised by constant attention-seeking," end quote. The problem with this is that stress is not known to manifest as attention-seeking behaviour in any other context, but it is undeniable that attention-seeking behaviour is competitive and that competition normally creates stress. In other words, when it comes to hysteria, it is by far more likely that stress is a symptom and attention-seeking behaviour is a cause. So the basic logic of attention-seeking behaviour predicts that when a group of attention seekers gather in a confined environment, there's going to be stress, there's going to be a hierarchy, and there are going to be casualties. These basic observations contradict the official narrative about hysteria in schools, which are, after all, places of high risk for contagious outbreaks of hysteria. Schools are places where young girls compete with each other for attention and where they become aware that they can emulate and compete even with the adult women for the things they most desire, up to and including their men. But schools are not the only confined environments where attention-seeking behaviour gets kettled. Convents, for instance, have a history of hysteria outbreaks stretching back over centuries. In one case, the nuns in a French convent adopted the bizarre habit of meowing like cats to the extent that they frightened the local population. This outbreak came to an end when the nuns were threatened with being whipped by the police. Another outbreak started at a German convent in the 15th century when the nuns there started to bite each other. Even though travel and communication was very difficult at the time and there was no such thing as a social network, the news spread widely and with it the behaviour. So it didn't take too long before nuns were biting each other in convents all the way from Holland to Rome. These episodes were very troubling for religious authorities who still at that time believed in things like demonic possession and witchcraft. So their responses for a long time were confined to exorcisms and rituals intended to banish the forces that were disturbing the nuns. But church authorities eventually learned that prayers don't work, and they had to manage outbreaks of hysteria in convents by separating the nuns, a tactic that is still the first response for outbreaks of mass hysteria today. Such outbreaks are anyway less likely to occur in convents now because there are not so many young novices in recent times. Nonetheless, an exchange that took place between Pope Francis and a nun as recently as January 2020 revealed that the memory of hysterical nuns is still fresh in the minds of Catholic clergy. It must have seemed to most people like an amusing throwaway remark, but it came with a history. During a public audience attended by crowds of nuns, one of them asked him for a kiss, and he replied, "I'll give you a kiss, but you must stay calm. Don't bite." Schools and convents are places that people can withdraw from if necessary or be sent home from if managers see fit. But prisons cannot send inmates home. They are also places which enforce a dress code even more restrictive than school uniforms, and they have rules about daily routines and behaviour to match. So the ordinary methods of attention seeking cannot work in prisons, partly because of lack of opportunity, and partly because of a peer group that is more hardened and cynical about the methods of teenage girls, especially when they're acted out by adult women. Tourette's syndrome is not therefore a popular choice for attention seekers in female prisons, but self-harm is. The Guardian reports that, quote, women prisoners are 4 times more likely to self-harm than their male counterparts, end quote. But even this number obscures the fact that women repeat the behaviour more frequently. So the actual rate of self-harm events, when measured by the number of incidents in 2009, was 13 times higher among the female population than among the population of male prisoners. In fact, even though women make up only 5% of the prison population, about half of the total number of self-harm incidents in state prisons occurs in female institutions. And perhaps most surprisingly, it is reported that in female prisons, quote, there were almost twice as many incidents of self-harm as there were prisoners, end quote. Gerry and Taylor, writing for the Journal of European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, describe hysteria, or attention seeking, from a healthcare perspective as, quote, a form of pretending elaborated in transaction with the medical system, end quote. But that analysis is just as relevant to the prison system and other systems as it is to healthcare systems. One has to understand that the prison system is surrounded with support networks of various kinds whose secondary or perhaps primary objective is to attract ever more government funding for their own niche in the system. Furthermore, many of those support and service networks are populated with feminists who use the unnaturally high incidence of self-harm in women's prisons to support narratives about women suffering more by confinement than men, arguing therefore that women should never be punished for their crimes. Gerry and Taylor wrote, quote, we show how enactments of sickness can be scripted by a group of involved persons, each contributing from their own perspective, end quote. In other words, the prisoners in jumpsuits are not the only ones gaming the system. When we look back at hysteria before the modern era of female empowerment, we can find books like Hysteria, Epilepsy and Neurasthenia, 1921, by Isaac Briggs, which describes, when talking about hysteria, how the departure of onlookers has a quenching effect on the performance, meaning that the attention-seeking behaviour of women was a matter of common knowledge to our ancestors, who were able to talk about that behaviour more freely than we are now. Briggs also expressed his concern about family members becoming hostages in the relationship and even enablers of the behaviour. He explains, quote, harmful sympathy is substituted for helpful discipline, and the more stable members of the family are often made slaves to the whims and caprices of the hysterical member, end quote. So the problem, as Briggs saw it, was that family members were not in a position to depart. But nowadays the problem is that organisations are the ones that cannot depart. Briggs also writes about the dangerous powers wielded by attention seekers in terms that would be very familiar now. He writes, quote, sensationalism is manna to them. If mild measures fail, then self-mutilation, half-hearted attempts at suicide, and baseless accusations against others are brought into play to focus attention on them, end quote. There was a time, of course, when hysteria was thought of as a kind of demonic possession, and the baseless accusations tended to involve witchcraft and devil worship. The history of the Salem witch trials reminds us that it was usually not the hysteric who paid the price for that. Now, in order to highlight an important common factor, I ask that my listeners bear with me while I recall some historical cases. In his 1859 book, Epidemics of the Middle Ages, the medical historian Hecker records the following events which occurred in the religious congregations of the Shetland Islands. He wrote, quote, paroxysms of this kind used to prevail most during the warm months of summer, and about 50 years ago there was scarcely a Sabbath in which they did not occur. An intelligent and pious minister, being considerably annoyed on his first introduction into the country by these paroxysms, obviated their repetition by assuring his parishioners that no treatment was more effectual than immersion in cold water. And as his church was fortunately contiguous to a freshwater lake, he gave notice that attendants should be at hand during divine service to ensure the proper means of cure. The sequel need scarcely be told. The fear of being carried out of the church and into the water acted like a charm, and the worthy minister for many years had reason to boast of one of the best regulated congregations in Shetland." End quote. This interaction with onlookers, or an audience if you will, is a crucial feature of hysteria. Even cases that could not be further apart, occurring in groups of women that never met or talked to each other, still share the same features. Shetland in the 18th century was a world apart from North Carolina in the 21st century, where health officials reported a case in one high school thus, quote, "The malady rarely occurred in class, but struck students in the hallway between classes, in the cafeteria or in the schoolyard during recess. The first stricken was a cheerleader, and the fear of catching her seizure may have made her fellow cheerleaders and other classmates nervous, triggering their blackout spells." End quote. The important issue to be noted in these examples is one that crops up in all of the accounts about outbreaks of hysteria, meaning the presence of an audience. But it is precisely the desire for an audience that women are pleading for when they say that women's voices are not being heard. In the past, there were certain limits as to how far those voices could travel, but not now, because there are many more kinds of audience than ever before. So the chronic form of hysterical behaviour has been freed from its limitations of travel by the explosion of internet communications and broadcast media. The JRSM acknowledges this danger in the title of its article, "Mass Psychogenic Illness and the Social Network. Is it changing the pattern of outbreaks?" The authors state, quote, "We may be witnessing a milestone where the primary agent of spread will be the internet and social media networks. The advice in handling episodes has until now not changed since that given during the latter Middle Ages, which was offer reassurance and separate the victims until the symptoms disappear. Given the proliferation of the internet and social media networks, this latter recommendation may prove problematic." End quote. Indeed, not only problematic, but actually disastrous for those on the receiving end of hysterical accusations. The neurologist who publicly revealed details of the case said, quote, "It's remarkable to see how one individual posts something, and then, in the next person who posts something, not only are the movements bizarre and not consistent with known movement disorders, but it's the same kind of movements. This mimicry goes on with Facebook." End quote. The reference to mimicry is very important because this is the mechanism for contagion. When we're speaking about fashions, we accept the presence of mimicry as a matter of course, and knowing the consequences for anybody who dares to criticise those foibles. But the pathologies of mental well-being can also be spread by mimicry, a mimicry that can be triggered either by direct contact, or virtual contact, or just by virtual rumour. The biting nuns proved that social media networks are not necessary for that. Before I move on from hysteria, there's one point to make that will be very familiar to my listeners. The JRSM includes in its article the details of this case. Quote, "In October 2011, several adolescent girls at a high school in the town of Leroy, New York, spontaneously developed facial tics, muscle twitching, and garbled speech. By early January 2012, it was revealed that the New York State Health Department had diagnosed the students with conversion disorder." End quote. This article also notes what the authors call key observations, namely, quote, "Why is the illness confined almost exclusively to adolescent girls? Why aren't siblings and parents affected, or those who've been working at the school for longer periods?" End quote. Now, these are excellent questions, but these questions also tell a story of their own, because they show some concern for siblings and parents and even for staff at the school, but they show no equivalent concern or interest in the boys at the same school. After all, the school also had a population of boys, so any objective assessment of the circumstances should include either a concern for their welfare or a curiosity about their immunity. In the absence of such obvious questions being raised, we are within our legitimate rights to ask, is this science or not? Perhaps this question is unintentionally answered by the New York Times journalist who, in her report on the case, wrote that one of the girls, quote, "looked impossibly brave," end quote. Well, why? That was for appearing on television. Overall, then, we are doing ourselves a disservice by viewing each dysfunctional behaviour and even some normal behaviour separately, and each psychological disorder as an isolated pathology. When we fit the pieces together and place the monster of hysteria side by side with other pathologies and social behaviours, The jigsaw illustrates a public health challenge exceeding our past experiences with tobacco and our present experience with obesity. This condition is the new normal, an epidemic of pathological immaturity whose contagious virus is female attention-seeking behaviour. The feminist industrial complex ruthlessly suppresses any linkage between the high levels of pathology and dysfunctional behaviour in women with attention-seeking behaviour. In the field of epidemiology, there would not be any obstacle to linking the negative health outcomes of adults with their dietary inputs as children. Indeed, it would be considered enlightened to recognise the association between the incidence of cancers, diabetes, allergies, and a host of physical and even mental health outcomes with deficiencies in childhood nutrition. But when it comes to the long-term accumulated effects of attention-seeking behaviour on girls and women, the vital lessons learned through the study of epidemiology are abandoned. The effects of the attention-seeking pandemic are, however, not confined only to public health, because they've also exerted an influence on our culture. The reason being that the moderators of mass consumer activity have fostered behaviours that overlap with the symptoms of hysteria, behaviours that have inevitably spilled over into the cultural and political discourse. Knowing this, we should have been able to predict that as the years went by, serious public discourse would become more emotional, more impulsive and more irrational, and that large numbers of people would at the same time become more susceptible to suggestion. These are, after all, naturally occurring behaviours that are fostered and tailored to suit consumers without limits. Furthermore, the early Freudian prospectors, aka advertisers, who dabbled in the psyche of consumers, found the goldmine of attention-seeking behaviour. A goldmine they exploited with such abandon that they helped open the door to self-conscious identity, or as it is otherwise known, identity politics. One of the earliest examples of this was the success that Edward Bernays had in encouraging women to smoke, a success he accomplished by entering fashionable girls in a parade and calling them débutantes that smoked. Ernst Dichter, commonly acknowledged as the father of motivational research, speaking in the post-war years, described a new frontier for the advertising industry when he summarized his work as, quote, the mobilization and manipulation of human needs as they exist in the consumer, end quote. An executive of Lehman Brothers Bank pushed this idea further by declaring that, quote, people must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed, end quote. No doubt with his own bank playing midwife for the burden of debt that would ensue. When faced with such firepower, what chance did attention seekers ever have? Because it was the attention seekers that were always going to be most susceptible. And indeed it was the attention seekers that responded en masse. This is, of course, a dispiriting story on its own, but it gets worse, because women were central to the work of advertisers. Women were attending the focus groups and the discussions. Women were on the front line of a pioneering new industry, and at least some of those women were feminists. But that was enough, because harmful behaviours are contagious in the female population so long as there is a perceived benefit to women. It is impossible to think that feminists did not know, and yet rather than object to practices that were being targeted at women, they adopted those practices. The realization that masses of women were attention seekers susceptible to flattery and suggestion provided fertile ground for feminists to push incoherent narratives that would make them rich and powerful, which also meant that as far as both feminists and the advertising industry were concerned, low-level chronic hysteria became the new mature. This behavioural phenomenon in girls and women is extraordinarily important, but unfortunately we cannot rely on scientists to unravel the cause and effects, which means there are negative changes occurring around us that we are unable to diagnose properly and therefore to address effectively. So just for the purpose of takeaway food for thought, let's perform this mental exercise. If we imagine attention seeking as a yardstick for measuring human behaviours, we can make some interesting observations. First of all, it is sometimes said that right from birth, females are more interested in people and males more interested in things. This observation is used to support arguments about females having more empathy and males caring less about people. But the yardstick of attention-seeking behaviour suggests that things don't give you attention. You have to give them attention, which makes those things a dead end for attention seekers. The same yardstick suggests its own reason why females try to pair with males who are taller than themselves. This phenomenon is frequently explained by the claim that women feel safe or secure with a tall man. But the attention seeker's yardstick tells us that tall people get more attention than short people, and that attention translates into benefits throughout their lives. Therefore, a population subgroup with elevated levels of attention-seeking behaviour will try to get the attention they want by attaching themselves to taller people. Furthermore, when we speculate on the possible origins of the female tendency towards attention-seeking, we might find that the child is more powerful than we supposed, because the influence of the mother on the child is essential to the child, but that influence might go both ways. So the mother rubs off on the child and the child rubs off on the mother, which could mean that the childish need for and response to attention, admiration and sympathy influences the needs and responses of the mother, and that once that need takes hold in the mother, it spreads by contagion in the female population. But who knows? Because after all, we don't study women in the same critical way that we study everything else, so it could just be a moral problem. If attention-seeking behaviour exercises such an obvious and powerful influence on the consumer and dating choices of women, then it is impossible to believe that it does not exercise a similar influence on their other choices, such as the reluctance of teenage girls to engage with school sports and physical exercise, or the educational and career choices they make when they leave school, or indeed the blind eagerness with which they consume the flawed and incoherent narratives of feminism. Even the annoying habit of attention seekers desperately trying to invade the spaces occupied by men they claim to despise may be explained by the simple fact that excluding them from attention is interpreted by them as an injury to their rights. Now is a good time to recall that Wikipedia description which stated that attention-seeking behaviour can result in the loss of a person's sense of agency, but the cumulative effects are more complex than that, because over time, attention seekers also tend to justify their needs with a sense of entitlement. That is, after all, the psychological connection that advertisers make, a connection that they address with carefully crafted statements such as, "because you deserve it." From the point of view of personal mental health, the loss of agency leads to a dependence on others, and the elevated sense of entitlement leads to frustrations which are interpreted as injustices. The individual effects on mental health are, of course, important in their own right, but they pale in comparison to the picture that reveals itself when we recall the analysis of Uriedny and Taylor when they wrote, quote, "We show how enactments of sickness can be scripted by a group of involved persons, each contributing from their own perspective." End quote. So the problem here is that in the absence of a medical care system or a prison system, feminists have to do their own scripting, which means that the need for attention, the loss of agency, and the elevated sense of entitlement become justified under the generic accusations of systemic oppression. It might seem like a stretch of the imagination to think that a relatively small group of feminists could exercise such sweeping influence over a much larger group of women, but feminists are not naive, and they know their hysteria, so they only have to find a few weakest links and leave the behaviour of mimicry to make the virus. Returning to the scene of the crime, the problems men are having are made worse by the consumer economy, which has locked in our dependence on a behaviour that is toxic to our well-being. We have allowed the pathological behaviours of the attention seeker to be translated into the habits of the consumer, making a society in which attention-seeking and mimicry, sexualization, impulsiveness, dramatization, and susceptibility to suggestion have become the new mature. Consequently, the behaviours of the chronic hysteric are not only left unchallenged, they are normalised, applauded, and even cultivated. Unfortunately, attention-seeking behaviour has moved beyond the childish affectation and the adult dysfunction, even beyond the spectacle of sexualization. This systemic behaviour has evolved into a strategy for profiteering from the complex systems, relationships and markets that converge to make up modern society. And perhaps most discouraging of all, the appearance of virtue has become an accessory, providing justification for the rewards and benefits obtained in the process. Female attention-seeking behaviour now drives the consumer economy and thus the politics of society, which gives even talentless women historically unprecedented power while at the same time making them susceptible to narratives. But this social change is taking place against the backdrop of a maturity paradox, which means the underlying discourse is not rational. There's no proof or logic with which one can appeal to a mature female conscience, at least as it relates to public discourse. So every attempt to curb the excesses of feminism or to defend the rights not only of men but also of their children may depend greatly on our ability to call out the attention-seeking behaviour of women. And finally, it's worth noting that attention seekers are not capable of feeling empathy for others in the same way they expect others to feel empathy for them. Given the disparity in attention-seeking behaviour, this simple fact has great meaning for men, but one can only shiver at the thought of what it must also mean to the unborn child in the womb. So I want to address those people who claim that they are not actually feminists themselves and therefore whatever. I need to inform you that there's a new rule in virtual land called "Your silence is compliance." So it's time for us to have a conversation about the gender maturity gap. Thanks for listening. Bye.